In the past, it was a staple of kidnappings for the hostage to hold up a newspaper to prove that they're still alive. The problem with me is that I started reading the newspapers I was holding up, although I'm still, as you can judge by our social media overlords, in captivity. Nevertheless, I'll try my best to get what news I can out to you given the constraints. First up, stories on the domestic news front that I'm tracking. There was an interesting article that came to my attention entitled "The New Luddites Aren't Backing Down." It starts with a journalist going to an international journalism festival, and she's very upset at the fact that everybody seems to take it as a foregone conclusion that journalists are quote-unquote writing too much. And they start talking about generative AI. And she begins by complaining that, don't you understand, if this goes on further, we're not going to have jobs anymore. If we don't do something to stop all the use of generative AI, it's not only going to destroy the industry, it's going to destroy, so many other sectors and walks of life as well. And in the article, it goes into the fact that what's happening now is similar to what happened to artisans, 300 years ago when the Industrial Revolution kicked off. The first Luddites were artisans and cloth workers in England, who at the outset of the Industrial Revolution protested the way factory owners used machinery to undercut their status and wages. Contrary to popular belief, they did not dislike technology. Most were skilled technicians. At the time, some entrepreneurs had started to deploy automated machines that unskilled workers, many of them children, could use to churn out cheap, low-quality goods. And while the price of garments fell and the industrial economy boomed, hundreds of thousands of working people fell into poverty. When petitioning Parliament and appealing to the industrialists for minimum wages and basic protections failed, many organized under the banner of a Robin Hood-like figure, Ned Ludd, who took up hammers to smash the industrialists' machines. They became the Luddites. The government mobilized what was then the largest ever domestic military occupation of England to crush the uprising. The Luddites had won the approval of the working class and were celebrated in popular songs and poems, and then passed a law that made machine breaking a capital offense. They painted Luddites as deluded and backward. Ever since, Luddite has been a derogatory word, shorthand for one who blindly hates or doesn't understand technology. Things go in cycles. As Mark Twain said, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so we're going through different oscillations right now in our society because of the release, as I said at the outset, of generative AI. And things like ChatGPT and all these other tools that should be used, as kind of not the main dish, but as kind of, the seasoning to the dish. But, of course, people are throwing out the dish and they're having just the AI without the human that's supposed to, humanize it and make it logical and, inject talent and originality into it. And so, this is causing a lot of disruption and is set to cause a lot of disruption. There are projections that upwards of 50% of the jobs within the next 10 years might be replaced due to AI. And this is going to cause all sorts of social disruption. The first phase of the Industrial Revolution was, of course, steam. Everybody remembers the kind of textile machines that were driven by steam, or the steamboat, all these, James Watt's steam engine, etc. The second phase came from America, and it was associated with electricity, right? And we're considered to be in the third phase, which was based on information technology culminating in AI. There are lots of disrupting things that the Industrial Revolution caused. People talk about all the great things, like you got a bunch of industrial goods for vastly cheaper than when the artisans made them in the feudal system. But there were a lot of sociological changes. I was reading a book called The War Against the Family, and it's not a book of the left. It's a very conservative book, but it makes some points that people from the left made at the time about how disruptive the Industrial Revolution was. It lured away young men in the 1700s away from their family farms to go to the cities, and they gave them higher wages than they would have made on the farm, and so they attracted that working population. But what happened was the collapse of family sizes. Before the Industrial Revolution, families basically lived on farms, which were like mini corporations with the father as CEO, as paterfamilias, right? And it would have like the mom, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, children all living on the same compound. And each would have their own kind of division of labor, their own segregated duties. Like mom might, do textiles, or your grandmother might churn the butter. Father and brothers would go out and do the farming and stuff like that, sow the seeds and take care of the animals, the livestock. And so they were basically outside of the money system, and they provided for all their own needs. They lived a pretty good life. But after the Industrial Revolution, when the young men were lured away, these farms collapsed, and it had a twofold effect on society. Number one, with less farms, there was less food. So there was all of a sudden, like famine. So they had all these industrial goods. They had lots of new shoes and stuff, new textiles, but all of a sudden they were lacking food. So that was a big, effect of the Industrial Revolution. Another was the fact that when you had, these collapsed families because the young men were gone, all of a sudden we get what we now today call the nuclear family, where it's just like mom, dad, two kids, or 1.3 kids, whatever it is. And it didn't used to be that. I mean, that is an artifact of something that happened, 300 years ago. Another big thing that happened was these young men crowded into these cities without their social systems, with the females left behind in the provinces. And suddenly there was prostitution that was, going to cater to these lonely young men. And there was an explosion of orphans. And that's where we get to, the Oliver Twist kind of period of England, where, there were just children running everywhere and snatching purses and doing all these things. And there were orphanages every like 3 blocks. There was an orphanage. And the fact that we don't see those anymore is largely due to the fact of abortion. So all of these pernicious kind of social evils rose up because of the destabilization of the Industrial Revolution. And there are some people who are worrying, about that now, which is why people like even the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski said the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for humanity. And he may not have been entirely wrong. His famous manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, was not very different from futurist Alvin Toffler's 1980 work, The Third Wave. They both agreed on a lot of the basic tenets of the dysgenic effects of technology and civilization, and how we're all being crowded into cities, and all of a sudden you see birth rates fall. We're going through a large demographic crisis as a result of this, and they're seeing it all around the world. Wherever they industrialize, all of a sudden you get urbanization. People leave their farms, like in India right now, and then they crowd into Mumbai. They create these slums, and it's much more expensive to have children in a city than it is, in the farm, because in the farm, they're labor, and they're actually a net positive. In the city, they're very expensive to keep, and so it goes from a benefit to a liability. So birth rates collapse. Cities are not really good things in terms of natural selection. I mean, look on a farm. Like in nature, cows have sharp horns. They're lean, they're mean, they're fast. But on the farm, they're kind of bred to be slow, fat, and stupid. And we see the same kind of dysgenic effects happening with human beings. And the political class likes that. They like weak, fat, and stupid people because they're easier to rule. They have no interest in the longer time horizon of what this means for the human gene pool, of course. And this is why it's dangerous, because we don't have a responsible political class that's kind of looking long term. And since we don't have a responsible political class, and since our richest oligarch class are getting rich on the new industrial revolution, there's little chance of putting the brakes on things. Elon Musk, for instance, he has billions of dollars, and he went in just 1 year from 113 billion to 250 billion. Mark Zuckerberg's annual change was from 78 billion to 123 billion. Jeff Bezos' fortune ballooned in the same time period from 65 billion to 174 billion. You get the point. Income disparities are off the charts. They're about at the same place now as they were right before the French Revolution. By the way, this is why communism became a thing in the first place. It was really a throwback to the feudal system by the same artisan Luddites who hemorrhaged under the Industrial Revolution. People like Robert Owen wanted to reestablish Amish-like communities to get out from under the thumb of the machine. Here to discuss this at greater length with me is Zaquerí Nioúel, so-called MAGA Marxist and Trump-supporting communist. He's the host of Radio Free Pizza and the founder of the Better Futures podcast. In the beginning of the introduction that I shot I basically am talking about the premise of the Luddites. And there was an article about a woman who was upset that generative AI was kind of going to render her job as a journalist moot. And she was very upset about that. And that to me was very reminiscent of what happened 300 years ago that led to the Luddite movement of artisans who were destroying machines because the Industrial Revolution came, started taking their jobs. And what most people, especially of our generation, don't really think about is communism started at that period, where
Hmm.
people were kind of it was a war against the machine, and you have Robert Owen with his utopian colonies and stuff, and he really wanted to create like Amish style communities that went back to the artisan place, and but people don't think of communism of that as communism. They've been trained to think of communism as kind of like managerial states by Eastern European bloc countries. So
Yeah, absolutely. And like you've seen of my writing so far,
mhm.
my ideological commitments are more towards the scientific materialist socialism as opposed to the, more utopian idealist branch. But I can at least speak to both. I know the Luddites offhandedly anyway.
Yeah, well, I wanted to start there, like because that's the main reason I wanted to interview you was the odd fact that you were both a communist on the one hand and seemingly sympathetic, let's say, to somebody like Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again movement.
Sure,
How did
yeah.
that happen?
Oh gosh. Well, so how do I tell this just in the briefest way possible? Um, I was swayed to anarchist tendencies through kind of an unusual venue. The novel series, The Once and Future King, it happens to end with a paean, I guess we'd say, of King Arthur saying like, "Oh, if we could have a world without borders, so that we didn't have this infighting between Scots and English or what have you." Probably because the four volumes are just such a good thing. I was really persuaded into that. Just I took up anarchism as an ideal to aspire for, I guess, or a telos for the human species, to use some language you'd be using. Um, and that happened to be occurring right around the time of Occupy Wall Street. And so I suppose we could say that the stars aligned in a fashion because I could easily see somebody with an anarchist sympathy going in a more right-wing, libertarian, voluntarist is another kind of term with this.
Mhm.
But perhaps only because of the climate, I went more towards the left wing and got interested in Marxism after that. I became quite disillusioned with anarchists, like other anarchists, during the recent worldwide medical intervention, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Exactly.
They sucked during that. Like my left anarchist people
Well,
just got
maybe
it
they weren't
wrong.
so anarchists after all. I mean, maybe it was a fashion pose rather than like a sound philosophical kind of belief system that they had,
Yeah. And
posers.
that's feel free to use any of this, by the way. But just to go off of what you just said, I can I can see aspects of that tendency, virtue signaling or whatever you want to call it. I can see aspects of that in my behavior in the run up to, well, I live in Minneapolis, so the George Floyd riots, like I was right here for it. And up until then, and for a long time after that, I certainly would have been more on the all cops are bastards, that kind of rhetoric, I suppose.
Mhm.
And now I see that as just playing into the overall neo-feudal agenda uh, of the globalists, I guess, or the
Mhm.
imperialists, as I would prefer to say, with kind of Leninist tendencies. But
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned Occupy Wall Street. I've done presentations on Occupy Wall Street when that happens around 2011. And the elite started getting very nervous when people started coming together. And right, you can see I did a video called 2012, and they
mm,
show fentanyl, nothing, 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 and then 2012, boom, hockey stick. Then they show, kind of usages of racial inflammatory things like white privilege,
Yeah.
nothing, 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 2012, boom,
Mhm.
and so they basically were afraid of the working class, is my thesis, and they decided to pit them against each other. So they started pitting black working class against white working class, against Hispanics, against gays, against women. And the CIA actually calls that a strategy of tensions. They actually have a
Yes.
term for doing that. And I mean, so you guys hit a nerve out there in Occupy Wall Street.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that we did. And by the way, you and I, we have the same thesis here. And just something I find really interesting is that I have heard this same argument made by figures as diverse as Norman Finkelstein on one hand and Vivek Ramaswamy on the other. Like the Occupy Wall Street scared the crap out of the ruling class and
Yeah.
forced them to go into an identity politics agenda to keep us all divided.
Yeah, exactly. There were in my book, Actionable Ethics, get it at Finder bookstores now. Uh, in Federalist 10, James Madison talks about that, like how he said the United States being so large would conduce toward keeping the people divided. And so you would never have a populist uprising because the people, it would be too unruly and too chaotic. And so I was thinking, I was struck by that even then. And in his formulation, right? He wasn't trying to be evil, but because he was thinking, okay, so a republic is an aristocratic form of government. We don't want it to degrade into a democracy, mob rule, and craziness, and kind of Black Lives Matter outside of judges' homes saying vote the right way, or because that's pure democracy. Like you use force. And so he said, okay, so we don't want that to happen. So, it's awesome that, our country will make everybody divided to a certain extent. And so his thinking was, okay, we set this up to grandfather in an aristocratic class. But what he didn't consider was that aristocracies degrade into oligarchies. So it became an oligarchy, and now it's grandfathered in with all these ways to divide the population. Like he would have been right on board with the FBI and CIA kind of dividing us. But he didn't, I don't think he foresaw that it would turn into an oligarchy, and now they're protected. And it's like,
Sure. Yeah, he didn't even have the telegram. So for him, the geographic divisions would have been a lot more compelling as a preventative measure. Yeah.
yeah, their internet was the postal system, you know.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
is, it's in the Constitution, right? So it was the information transmission system at that time period. And it's funny when you look into the postal system, just really quick as a digression,
Please.
it was run by the Taxis and Turn family in Europe and Germany, the first modern postal system. And they would steam open letters. They would pretend that your
Uh,
letters were, kind of confidential, but they would steam them open, get intelligence. And a young Myra Amschel Rothschild, he became friends with the Turn and Taxis family, and he would get the benefit of being able to steam open letters and do investments based on insider knowledge. So the postal system was very much like the internet, where you're led to believe, hey, my emails are secure, but really Google is like monitoring them.
yeah.
Nothing changes,
Yeah, that's man, I have like two things at least that to go off on that. It's interesting to put the Postal Service into this context just because recently, at least I'd like to hear it more often anyway, people calling for the internet to be a public utility so
Mm,
that big tech can't just throw us all into the algorithm ghetto, as Bowie likes to say. I like that phrase anyway.
yeah.
Um, and let's see. So that's number one. Number two, I'd like to find out where was that family in Europe?
Yeah, Germany, Turn
In
und Taxis. It was Thurn and then Taxis, like taxis, like hailing a taxi.
um,
Turn
oh,
und
cool.
Taxis.
All right. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that
Yeah.
that
So hmm,
that anecdote was in the Rothschilds, which was a biography of the family. Me and my boy were reading it, and so it was just interesting, like how he, rose to power. And one of the ways that he rose to power was the British. Like he worked for a guy. He was the treasurer of a guy named William Hesse Kassel, and so he was in the state of Hesse, where Hessian soldiers were from. And so
oh,
William would sell mercenary soldiers. And so when the American, Revolutionary War happened and the British were running low on soldiers, Rothschild got rich on selling soldiers, mercenaries, kind of like Blackwater. So like I said, like nothing changes. I mean, the technology will change, but like these systems of wealth aggregation and stuff. And I wanted to make that point too. Because we're talking, you seem to have been interested when you saw me in an interview about the mercantilist system, the
Yeah,
mercantilists versus the capitalists and stuff. And I think we're going through that. I mean, it's very similar to 300 years ago, except instead of industrial loom machines, it's Chat GPT. Instead of capitalism with factories, it is 3D printing. And in 1776, I can't remember if it was Carol Quigley, but I think it was Carol Quigley. He pointed out that that was the same year that the Industrial Revolution created mass-produced rifles for the first time, 1776. And so
oh,
that's not a
no,
coincidence. The
yeah,
revolution
that was
happens.
Honore Blanc, wasn't it? The Frenchman?
I don't know who
Okay.
did it. I just remember Carol Quigley, I think, like said it in passing, and it just stayed in my mind. I was like 1776. Wow, what a coincidence.
Wow. Yeah.
Because before it was artisans, you would get a rifle and it would just be specifically for you. If some piece of it broke, it wasn't standardized enough to just, and so when they did the Industrial Revolution, guns came down vastly in price. So now everybody could have a gun where they couldn't in the past. And Quigley, to his to his credit as a man of the left, he admitted at the beginning of the book, Tragedy and Hope, he said that the countries where the people got the guns were like the freer countries, and the countries where the government got the guns and not the people, like China or Russia, became despotic because the power dynamic was such that the government had the power as opposed to in the West. And right now they're reversing that. Like they lost power, the aristocratic class, and now little by little they're trying to get it back
Yeah.
to, you know.
That's a really fascinating that point you just made about gun control or gun rights is a really interesting um there's an example of it taking place right now on the quote unquote left. And I say quote unquote because I like to make this division between the synthetic left and just the more, let's say, materialist, communist inspired kind of left, as opposed to the idealist, progressive socialists. Calling it synthetic left, I take that from Caleb Maupin, who
Mhm.
does many long presentations on these sorts of things, but it's the kind of leftism that the CIA attempted to develop following World War II. Like, oh, let's give them all acid and tell them they're expanding their minds, and that will somehow change the economic conditions of the world. I guess somehow, yeah, that seems
Joe Rogan
possible to them.
leftism.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that kind of the modern day inheritors of that seem to be people who would want to take guns away from the working class.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny you mentioned that as well, because a big part of that is training the youth, right? Like using the institutional, schools, the public school system, to train them to associate their rights with something scary or bad. And I was thinking about that, just going back to the
Hmm.
topic of the Industrial Revolution, and we're kind of going through a retread, and the way that older people interpreted technology, like the artisans had gotten displaced and they were bitter and angry and upset, and rightfully so. And The young people, however, right? They weren't trained like older people were trained to think like Charlie Chaplin in modern times, the hell of the factory and stuff, the dehumanization of it. Whereas young people were marketed with Star Wars. They were marketed with R2D2 and C3PO and the bot is my friend, And so you could see this kind of disparity emerging generationally. And I kind of see that now, where the older people are skeptical of things that are happening, and the young people, because they're more entrained, they're closer to the propaganda matrix. They're kind of like, take my guns away, take my bodily autonomy away, protect me,
Yeah,
like nanny state and stuff like that. So I don't know.
yeah.
What's your take on where do you see the youth going? Toward communism or toward more of like a, you know, uh, mercantilist, kind of materialist consumer group of zombies?
I do see the youth of today going more in that direction. However, I shouldn't speak as though I am a member, I guess. I'm a millennial as opposed to a Gen Z, so maybe I don't have the strongest read on this. but it seems to me that they aren't concerned about promoting dependency. Like I'm going to use universal basic income as an example. That would, I think, probably be the standard Generation Z leftist prescription to address the immiseration of the working class resulting from AI and automation.
Mhm.
But they do not see at all how that would be especially terrible in our current central banking system, I think, and how the CBDCs are, well, at least it was it Christine Lagarde who was saying that the European CBDC should be programmed to, delete itself out of your wallet. Uh, Somebody was saying that, and that sounds horrible. I can't imagine, but I know that they exist. People out there who consider themselves friends of the working class, who want the working class to never be able to save,
Yep.
or it's
Accrue
amazing.
wealth. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
they.
Like the Chinese, the yuan, the digital yuan has that where it'll like, expire after
Mhm.
a set period, whether it's a month. And if you don't spend your digital yuan, they just disappear. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, like that, you're licensing your money. I did a presentation on that, like the licensing model that the kind of oligarchical class
Mhm.
wants us to be on. They don't want us to own anything. You will own nothing and be happy. And which is funny, to go back to the mercantilist thing, I think you might have seen me posting about the Fabian Socialists. And the
Oh,
Fabian
yeah.
Socialists, yeah, they said that they had two, according to their official document, The History of the Fabian Society by Edward Pease in the 30s. And he said in the 1870s, they had two basic origins of their ideology or their philosophy. One was the American Henry George, who said that, people shouldn't own property. And he had very interesting ideas related to that are not evil or pernicious, but he was very skeptical of property ownership because it was so tied to the feudalism and the aristocrats, and they were abusing it back in England. They were raising property
Mhm.
values outside of market forces, and it got so bad that the average Englishman, it cost like a week's wages to buy a loaf of bread. And so Karl Marx was looking at the United States that had no aristocracy, nobody
Mhm.
manipulating land prices, and there was tons of land and it was empty. And so because there was nobody manipulating the land, more of the money could be spent not on rents, but on wages for workers. So workers got paid 2 to 3 times the wages in Europe and the United States. And so they were like, that's nice. Without an aristocracy, the people are flourishing and they have all
Mhm.
this wealth. They're not starving like in Europe. And so that's what Henry George was saying. So that was one of the things. But the other thing they said was John Stuart Mill, who had that
Mhm.
argument of he wrote an essay on socialism, and he was saying, like the greatest good for the greatest number, happiness, the greatest happiness for the greatest number was the term.
Sure.
And so from those two things, you will own nothing and you will be happy. From
Of
the World
course.
Economic Forum, the same formulation but it goes back to that licensing thing. You won't
Mhm.
own anything, but we'll license you stuff. We'll license you your washing machine. We'll license you your refrigerator. But the problem with licensing is you think you've bought something, like for instance, a book. You buy an ebook and you think you bought it. You were told you bought it, but all of a sudden they have the ability to yank it off of your e-reader or to change text. They got busted changing text. Barnes
Oh,
and Noble.
wow. I didn't know. Dang.
Yeah,
Oh.
and because you licensed it, as
Mhm.
opposed to owning it. And so now if you're licensing your money, right, if they can shut your money off, you don't own it. So
Mhm.
you're
Yeah.
why are you working? So now they want you like a hamster in a wheel where you
Yeah.
can never stop because you can't ever save. And it's like, it's such an
Well,
evil model.
yeah. And you also probably won't have a job to go and work at, if I guess the pace of technological development just continues. So could have masses starving under the wage slavery system, and that wouldn't be very good. But fortunately, they'll have like robot soldiers by that time, right? Hope. Uh,
Or
uh,
migrants.
oh yeah, of course.
Migrants sent in to
Yeah.
attack the populace if the
God,
populace gets out of hand.
man, that was a really amazing thing to watch. That was Senator Dugan? No, not Dugan. That's a philosopher I've encountered recently.
Mm.
Oh man, just the idea of proposing that you would hire foreign citizens as your military. It's insane. Like I have much harsher words, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's what happens when you're basically living under an occupation government. And
Hmm.
this is where we're getting back to where we were. It's Back to the Future. We might even entitle this interview Back to the Future because we're circling back. I was just going over the Hundred Years' War with my son, and I'd never looked into it. And so apparently, so you have these French-speaking noblemen in France,
Mhm.
right? So and then they conquer England. William the Bastard goes from France into England, conquers everything in 1066. A lot of his nobles become his generals. He rewards them with land in England, and so they live for hundreds of years in England, owning land in England and in France. And, over the
Ooh.
centuries, as they became more English and were separated from France, France wanted that land back. And so you had the situation for many centuries where you had people who were ruling a country but were not the same ethnicity as the people in the country. And they
Ah.
tended to treat them very, very badly, like the French speaking. That's why to this day, the bad words for everything are Anglo-Saxon, because when the French speakers came in, they looked at them like they were uncouth. They were just cavemen. They were less than. And so that's why to say, well, I won't even say it because I'll, get in trouble. But the C word for women's genitalia,
Sure.
right? Why is that a bad word? It's just the Anglo-Saxon word for it, right? Why is
Mhm.
vagina the good word for that? And the reason is because the French speaking, Latinate ruling class,
Wow.
used Latin and the Anglo-Saxons didn't. So they treated them very, very badly and still do. I mean, 1,000 years later, and they're still stigmatized. Why is ain't a bad word? Why are all these like Anglo-Saxonisms? Why is that uncouth? And it's because you have one ethnicity ruling over another. And historically, like the Spaniards in Mexico with the Aztecs, I mean, they treat them very, very badly. And that's why republics I mean, they started out essentially as ethnostates so that you
Mhm.
didn't have Group A ruling over Group B. But now we're back to that, where you have somebody from a totally different country or culture ruling over and you're basically in an occupied nation. Like I said, like right now, I literally believe we're under occupation of the British Empire, what used to be the British Empire that is now going by the United Nations or calling itself NATO.
Yeah.
And that's why we can't close our borders. That's why our laws are being ignored because we're being told, "Oh, you're in a post-legal system. NATO is your laws." And I think that's why Ukraine is so important to them as well. They need our military kind of short-circuited and plugged into NATO and then in
Oh.
some other continent,
Oh.
while they're flooding the border because they want to, essentially they have to destroy an ethno state to be able to control it. And that's why the new the new bugaboo is racism, because you use race and you use ethnos to build a society. You use anti-ethnos to destroy one, to tear one down. And I think we're in the process of it being dissolved. And that's what's happening. So I've been talking way too much.
Oh
Go.
no, hey. You brought me back to Dugan, who I mentioned a moment ago, actually talking about ethnos. Um, I think that it becomes complicated when we're talking about the United States, however, because to what extent could we ever have called this an ethno state? I mean, I suppose in terms of the state, like the straight white males who are, demons from hell, blah, 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 me being one of them. We ran things, but the civilization itself, the nation, I mean, didn't have, in my conception of it, didn't have that natio, like we are all of the same ethnic origins.
Mhm.
Maybe I just have a more melting pot understanding of America that wouldn't be accurate to its early founding days.
Well,
Like,
that's why I'm reading, as a book called Dream Worlds of Race, and it's
yes.
by Duncan
And this
Bell.
is where you got with a little bit of that, like the UN is a shell company sort of thing, right?
Well, yeah, well, that among other books.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, he is talking about like the rhetoric they were using, in the 19th century, early 20th century of race. Everything was race, race. The British race has a duty, a destiny in the world to spread civilization, and that was their
Hmm.
kind of their talking points. The white man's burden and all this stuff. Rudyard Kipling, the
Absolutely. Yeah,
imperialist rhetoric.
I actually like Kipling as a writer, but
Yeah, well, well, of course, I'm sure, but that doesn't mean he wasn't talented. Same thing with H.G. Wells. I love H.G. Wells's writing, but he was on the payroll. He was a Fabian socialist, but terribly talented man though. But yeah, but they were talking like in terms of race, like uniting, all the Anglophone, countries in terms of like a racial composite. And
Mhm.
they said that they wanted to take the settler colonies, as they called them, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and then meld them, create a block, an English-speaking block. And then they said from there, then they would take over the rest of the world, and they would install what they called global federalism, where you had a federal layer controlled by the Five Eyes, by the the Anglo-Saxon bloc, and everybody else would be kind of like underneath that, like states in the United States, where they would have
Sure.
some sort of autonomy, but very limited. And it would be short circuited by this federal layer controlled out of London. And they said that they would do this through treaties. And that's why when you see the North Atlantic Treaty Organization happening or after World War II, I mean, that was essentially, in my estimation, the nail in the coffin of the United States, because we got subsumed into this grid with a CIA installed in our country to make sure that we're not patriotic to our country, we're patriotic to global NATO interests. And like the CIA, like the very first country they deposed was Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 for British Petroleum.
Oh,
And
of
you have to
course,
ask
yes.
you have to ask yourself, why is the CIA doing the bidding of British petroleum? And then you realize, oh, because they're not actually American. They're
Mhm.
installed in our country unconstitutionally to make sure that our country doesn't operate for its own benefit, but operates for this larger global grid that I think is run out of London. And I think there's, like people left, right, and center, like the John Birch Society on the right, screaming since the 50s about, kind of the Council on Foreign Relations in England and London and Milner and Cecil Rhodes, and then people on the left like Carol Quigley or Duncan Bell making the same admission. So it's kind of like what you said about Occupy Wall Street, where it's people all across the bandwidth. So that's how you know something is most likely probably true if everybody
Mm.
can agree on certain baseline facts. And I think, that's
Sure.
one of those
Well,
situations.
going off of what you just said about Occupy Wall Street and how identity politics was kind of introduced to smother that working class movement, I actually think of Fabian socialism as this in the same way, because the Fabian Society was founded the year after Karl Marx died, which was what, like 12 years after the Paris Commune. So it seems to me that guild socialism, as I've heard you call it, or more idealist utopian socialisms in general, uh, these seem like, I mean, just in the way that I make narratives out of history based on my own ideological, yeah, it seems to me that this would be a way of defanging the working class. And the working class also does come with a kind of patriotism would that would not work well in this NATO empire, Anglo-American trading bloc or imperial bloc. Um, for example, although Karl Marx, I understand he started out very, anti-nation state, perhaps more of a Trotskyite, or of course Trotsky coming later, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, I know that towards the end of his career, he became a huge supporter of Irish nationalism and Irish liberation because he saw how exploiting the Irish colony was really keeping the British aristocracy in power and contributing to, well, the constant poverty of the British working class too. So, in that regard, it seems like a working class nationalism would be the antidote. But I would be quite a bit more skeptical personally of any imperialist nationalism. Like,
Mhm.
no, the United States needs to start projecting its power for its own purposes, not for Britain's purposes anymore.
Yeah.
That seems like it would be a complete nightmare to me.
That's
So,
Richard Spencer. Talks about like how he wants the United States to rule other countries and go around the world, and that's how he's a shill. But anyway, I was talking to my son. You just reminded me of something. I was talking to my son about where clothing comes from, right? So we were talking about tailors and how, like in the 19th century, 18th century, the guy who tailored something, designed it, would be the same guy who cut out the cloth, the pattern, stitched it, and did all the steps to it. And I said, now, like you can have a designer in New York, and then he sends that design to like, Indonesia, and people
Mhm.
halfway around the world are the people actually doing it, and then they ship it to a different distribution center in a different continent. And so I was thinking about how our economy right now is decentralized. At exactly the moment, our political system is highly centralized. And when the country started, it was the opposite. We had a highly decentralized political system and a highly centralized economic system. Like the same guy, like Paul Revere. Paul Revere lived in an apartment above his silversmith shop, right? And the guy next to him had like a pickle shop, and he lived in the apartment above the pickle shop. Or the guy next to him was a carpenter, and they all
Right.
did every single step of what they did. It wasn't
Yeah.
outsourced to different countries. And so yeah, that just bizarre thing that we went from a centralized economy and a decentralized government to a decentralized economy and a highly central, it's very odd. I
Yeah.
don't know what it means, but strange
Hmm.
shift.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I did think of while you were speaking about the designer sends their design to the factory in Bangladesh or wherever,
Mhm.
everyone in that step of the process is being alienated from the actual labor itself. Like even removing the Marxist commitments for the extraction of labor value and so on.
Mhm.
If I am simply an artisan living next to Paul Revere or whoever, I'm in every step of the process, and that gives me uh, a greater sense, God, a greater sense of accomplishment, number one, but
Mhm.
also an overall more robust ethos, I would say, in the
Mhm.
work that I perform. And that's critics of capitalism, think I think they might win over conservatives a bit more if they talked about how destructive it has been to the human spirit, how it has just ravaged our values in the past 200 years.
Yeah,
Like,
I've
my
had a
God.
conversation just like on this theme. But go ahead, I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, no, it's horrible. I mean, I've told you in private messages, I assume you're a Kantian. I haven't quite figured that out yet, but
Mm.
whatever. You clearly don't care very much for utilitarianism, or you see the
No.
danger in a utilitarian mindset. Uh,
Yeah, I
everywhere
see
I look.
utilitarianism as anti-ethical. It's just do what is expedient. And I don't think
Hmm.
that doing what is expedient is always, I think we're living right now under a time period where people are doing what's expedient. And sometimes what's expedient in the short term, you know, creates havoc in the long run. And it might be a great payout right now, to do particular things, but you're not like, for instance, the economic system, right? Like
Mhm.
how we have this crazy economic system where mothers can't stay home with their children. And
Aha.
all of a sudden you see feral children and gangs and violence.
You mean
And
I
we
was a
so
feral
so
child?
we're not looking long term, huh?
Oh, I was just making a joke. My mom also had to work when I was younger, so being a single mom, maybe I was a feral child. That would
Mm.
explain a lot, actually.
Yeah, I mean, all of us were latchkey kids, and we didn't
Mhm.
have, and this is how you disrupt cultural transmission, where,
Yeah.
if you went back, a century or not even, and a mother would crochet, and she would teach
Mhm.
her daughter to crochet, and she would teach her daughter to, and they had skills that traveled intergenerationally, and all of a sudden, with the incorporation of women in the workforce, which we were told, oh, it's this wonderful thing, but actually it was just to double the labor pool so they could pay workers less. So it was a scam. And I just had a talk with an interview with the guy at the Bank of England about that in the London School of Economics. And
Oh.
yeah, I mean, like, but we were given this, this bill of goods of, oh, and I did a tweet about that recently about like the serpent, he doesn't present himself to
Uh,
Eve as her oppressor, but as her liberator. And so women's lib was kind of sold under the same aegis, I'm going to liberate you by making you go into a cubicle and chaining you to this economic system, and you'll never, like have a family or children, and you'll live with your cat and be on Xanax. Isn't that wonderful?
yeah.
I've liberated you. And
And
really, it was just like a trap, and all of us
yeah.
are hurting inside. Like you said, like when you're alienated from your work and your work has no meaning, like factory production, and you're doing just one small piece and you can't see the totality of it. And your life seems empty and meaningless and gray. And in the 50s, they talked about that. They called that mass man. And it was kind of like Charlie Chaplin, we
Uh,
alluded to in the factory, where he starts going insane. And
mhm.
I had a conversation just like the one you kind of suggested. I was talking to a man at the left, and he's in an investment bank and he runs their sustainability department. And I was like,
Oh,
yeah, you would make a lot more inroads with the right if you were making these positions that materialism is, like, pure materialism
mhm.
is deadening to the soul and it's destructive. Like Talcott Parsons, the social scientist in the 30s, he said that capitalism is inherently corrosive of traditionalism. because
Mhm.
capitalism is always seeking for new ways to do things. So on the right, where I'm from, you have like the kind of Pied Piper, Ben Shapiro types lying and saying, "Oh, you can
Mhm.
have capitalism and traditionalism, and they'll both coincide." And no, one erodes the other. So all these things that people, that conservatives are complaining about are happening precisely because of the economic system that they think is so wonderful, because they don't really scratch the surface and realize
Yeah.
that, capitalism is not conservative, and never
Gosh.
was.
Yeah. Uh, Couple things to say about that, and then probably a little more. This something that I find really funny about conservatives is so Bill Gates and George Soros, etc., they're evil globalists who are out to destroy America and so on. But capitalism, the system that put them into this position, that is untouchable. Like you cannot ever criticize that.
Yeah,
That's just
exactly.
that's a amusing knee-jerk thing. Um, Getting back to women's liberation though for a second, uh, I do want to say that it was the financial dependence. Like, I know that this wasn't the case in the 1960s, but previously in history, women just didn't own property. They didn't have any way to sustain themselves without a husband or something like that. I mean, perhaps there were, more scandalous ways that a woman could get by. And I'm sure that this doesn't apply to all women, but that it does seem like economic security was a huge part
Yeah.
of patriarchal system. And
Well,
so they were
economic
sold,
security would be the family.
yeah. Well, oh, geez. In that case, it seems like women liberation was, it didn't come with that economic security that it should have, I suppose, or that liberation would actually imply to me. Um, I understand the importance of it. Like, women, were often treated quite terribly. There were many loving marriages, but there were a lot of wife beaters. And for women to have the ability to go into a workforce and not be in that kind of situation, it's important. But yeah, it was apparently mishandled in under the capitalist mode of production, I guess, to again just default to some communist whatever.
Well, capitalism will always go to the cheapest possible solution for profits, and slavery is the cheapest. But so if you don't have a political class, like a respectable, responsible political class that will rein that tendency in, it will immediately go to slavery. And so, a friend of mine who's at the Central Bank of Canada, he told me about this website called, I think it was What the F Happened in 1971 or whatever it is.
Oh,
And
the gold.
historically, like Marxists talk about, labor value and productivity and all these things. And so historically, the more productivity that you had, the more pay you got, right? And that made
Mhm,
sense. Hey, I work more, I get paid more. That would make sense until 1971. In
mhm,
1971, you see them tracking productivity and pay, and then all of a sudden, 71, the wages flatline and the
mhm,
productivity explodes. The average worker becomes 4 times more productive because of technological advances, but is not getting paid anymore. And so what happened in 1971? And what happened was they doubled the labor pool with women. And so that was their way of basically having an excuse. Hey, Bill wants to get paid $30,000 a year. Well, I have Susie here who will get paid 27,000. So I'm not going to hire Bill. And it created a downward pressure on wages. And then once they ran through the women, that's when they started doing, incorporating Eastern Europe in the labor pool, China in 1990 in the labor pool. And then when they ran out of them, then they started doing illegal immigration. So it's one scam after another to keep from paying people. And so like I get, kind of what you're saying about, the women, who might have been
sure.
beaten or something. I mean, that's what we were taught. But I'm not so sure. I mean, every system has deficits, liabilities and benefits, right?
Mhm.
I'm not so sure that we treated women all that bad. I mean, we default too much, like in Turkey, for instance, they would be more patriarchal, whereas we
Mhm.
were more like bicameral, where you had a mother's influence and a father's influence, and much more so with the mother's influence. And that's why, like a lot of social scientists believe in the West, we trended toward liberalism because of the power that women had. So
Ah,
were we just all beating the women? I'm not sure that narrative
sure.
was totally true,
Yeah.
but.
Well, hey, I appreciate you complicating it. Like that's, huh? That's a really interesting
We're
potential
gynocentric.
attribute of Western liberalism, I suppose.
Some
And
who did I get that from too? Just recently, I was reading about that, where the person was saying that he was attributing the the liberalism of the West to the fact that we had so much of an influence from women, and especially in the United States because we like scarcity imparts value, right? So if you look in the 19th century, there were very few
mm,
women out west. It was
mhm.
rough going. It was very no roads, no streets, no plumbing. And so they would get mail order brides. And when those women went out there, they were treated like gold. That's why they had the first woman governor. That's why women got the vote out there, like in Wyoming and stuff, before the rest of the country did. And progressivism was, exploding in the Midwest and the West, largely due to, according to this thesis, to how well we treated women. And so yeah, but like I said, but this is neither here nor there because the people calling the shots, they don't care at all about women any more than they care about men or any more than they care about like migrants who are coming over or anybody else. They're just exploitative, and these are just narratives they give us so that we,
Yeah,
shut up and take less pay and don't like your generation really got screwed. Your generation
yeah,
should have been the beneficiary after the retiring of the boomers. There should have been
yeah.
more houses on the market as they downsized, which means housing prices should have gone down, stocks should have gone down. You guys should have been able to buy into the system, and instead they, through manipulation, they kept your wages down. They put you in debt, to go to college and all these things that previous generations didn't have to. I mean, the fee for you to go to college, as opposed to like our parents' generation or great grandparents, is insane. So you
Hmm.
guys really should have been the wealthiest, most, affluent generation, and they stole that from you.
Yeah. Thank you for acknowledging that.
Occupy Wall Street, right? That
Yeah,
was you guys got screwed.
yeah, yeah. Millennials really did, but something about Walter Benjamin, if you're familiar with him.
Mm-mm.
Uh, it's about so he was a 1930s, not entirely orthodox Marxist, but he didn't get quite as crazy as like Louis Althusser, who I actually like quite a bit, frankly. But
Mm.
nonetheless, he's certainly not an orthodox Marxist and wrong about numerous things. He just has some cool ideas. But Walter Benjamin had a very literary kind of interpretation, or I shouldn't say interpretation. He had a very literary presentation of a kind of inventing a Marxist telos, I could almost say. Like there's already an embedded aspect of it, but as opposed to, um, for example, the bloody libidinal release of murdering the man who's been stealing my wages, this is more about redeeming the working class. Like my ancestors toiled in horrible conditions. Uh, like I'm like Southern Europe, British Isles, so I'm just going to assume that I'm sorry, I'm combination of those two being an American mutt. But in the British Isles, I assume that I had an ancestor who was working child labor for like 12 hours a day in the 1830s. Uh, Southern Europe, I'm a little bit less like I just don't know what it must have been like in the Czech Republic in the 1800s at that time. But
Horrible.
nonetheless, I'm sure that those people were living very hard lives and that it could have been better if it weren't for either greedy factory owners or greedy noblemen. Take your pick.
Yeah, well, I think like in the Czech Republic, by the way, it was mining. That was the
Oh, okay.
big and they might have been like Welshmen in England were also kind of known as coal monkeys.
Oh, yeah.
So you may have depending on what your your background is, whether it's Wales, but although I don't know, I won't dox you. Um,
Okay. Cool.
but yeah, I mean, those were hard, short lives, and Marx talks about that in Das Kapital. He talks about child labor.
I was
Um,
just reading that. Yeah.
yeah, he talks about like how in Maine, I think it was, they passed a law that was a liberal law that made it so that children only could work 12 hours a day. How how
Mhm.
how lovely, and
Yeah.
so there was a lot of concern, a lot that when you look back at it, even as a conservative, even from my point of view, that there were legitimate causes for looking at the system as it then existed and seeing how inhuman it was, how brutal that it was. And once again, they used children as just like how I said that they used women later on, they used children in the first iteration of the Industrial Revolution to get rid of men and to
Ah,
pay a child a sixth of the wages that they would
oh,
pay
that's
like
right.
an artisan. Yeah, so that's like the game, generation by generation is how do we get cheaper labor out of said group of people, and what group do we use to displace them? So what made you just to circle back around about the Trump thing? What made you said Occupy Wall Street? You started questioning
Oh,
kind of your original kind of brand of leftism, but then you how did you get to Trump? That's perplexing.
oh God. Well, so you're referring to me as a Trump supporter is a little bit tongue in cheek for myself. Um, I so I like to acknowledge good things that people have done. Like Joe Biden, terrible human being, complete garbage. I really wish that he weren't senile so that we could see him hanged. But well, anyway, he did try to cancel my student debt, or he like kind of pretended to try, even
Mm.
though they knew that it wouldn't go through. So that was a nice thing. Trump, on the other hand, Trump canceled the Trans-Pacific Partnership and he tried to get us out of the WHO. Those are two awesome things, in my opinion. Now, he also recently said that he could end Ukraine in 24 hours, which he said before, but this time he said it because he'll just give him all the guns. So he's still like a loser, in my opinion. Anyway,
And
that
yeah,
being
and he's
said,
still not taken take like he has the right instinct about NATO, about getting rid
yeah,
of it. We would get our sovereignty back if we did that. I don't think
yeah,
he fully understands what NATO truly is.
yeah. I
So
think he
yeah,
has decent instincts. I just think he's kind of a coward. Sorry.
yeah,
But I
yeah.
guess I would be too if I were up against Mossad and so on. Anyway,
You'd a gun pointed at your head for every
yeah,
decision you made, and your children. I don't see how anybody goes into politics, but I think one of the big ways that we get our freedom back, just as a commonality, right? So someone who's not a communist or doesn't, think along those lines, to someone
sure.
who may be more of a communist, we have a lot of commonalities, and that's why they're terrified of Occupied Wall Street, because a bunch of different people realized, hey, we have all the same enemy. And they don't want us to ever come to that conclusion, whether you're a woman, whether you're black, whether you're a displaced white worker, whether you're whatever, it doesn't matter. That
Mhm.
all of a sudden you realize, hey, wait, they're all picking all of our pockets, and you realize we're the tax serfs. And so, but just to, kind of circle this back together,
Sure.
it's very heartening, like hearing your
Oh,
evolution, I should say,
oh,
regarding this. But regarding student loans, I just want to make this point really
sure.
quickly. The Treasury last year, they had the assets of the United States, and the single
Uh-huh.
largest asset of the United States
Were
was student
bonds
loan debt.
guaranteed by my, yeah, I know. It's a very infuriating scam.
So they're not
Uh,
ever going to get rid of it because
yeah.
it's too lucrative and they keep getting you guys in debt. And it's like, and that's what I said. So it's real lucrative up front, but you're destroying the economy. Like, as later on, we
Mhm.
need these young people to buy houses. We need these people to start families. We need them to like buy into the system, but they're so
Mhm.
greedy and corrupt and short-sighted that like,
Yeah.
where's this going to end?
Well, where is it going to end? So that now I can get back to answering your question a little bit better, I think. Like I just described a couple reasons why I'm not willing to say Trump is the Antichrist yet, I guess. He needs to survive a head wound first. Is that the way it
Yeah,
goes?
there you go.
But anyway, um, one thing that was not clear to me during Trump's original campaign was how much his supporters actually understood the basic lay of the land, speaking in terms of geopolitics and so on. Like, I could quibble with certain things. At the time, the border wall seemed like, oh, they're just racist, blah, blah, blah. Or race seemed like it could have been a much stronger motivator. But 8 years later, um, I live in Minnesota in the United States, and it's still not like an issue for me here. Like I would not actually notice the migrant crisis if I weren't hearing about it because I live in the northern part of the continental, blah, blah, blah. But now I know that Democrats are talking about it. Like the normal, just centrist liberals I see at the coffee shop, they are now talking about what a crisis is, and they are blaming Republicans for not passing the bill that would get them the funding for their wall. And they don't see how this is all just going to help Trump in a couple months because now they're on board with what he was saying 8 years ago. They're so dumb. Anyway,
That is hilarious. Yeah,
yeah.
but you're just to offset that as well. I mean, the narrative of, racism be playing into this. Uh, Even before Mexican immigration, or now African, it's mostly, I mean, we're getting flooded with people from sub-Saharan Africa now.
Also seeing
Um,
Chinese.
oh
Brett
yeah,
Weinstein was talking.
massive.
Anyway,
Yeah, massive Chinese presence. Exactly. And so we're not even getting our own continent, like we were told, forever.
uh,
And but it was the fact that in the 1840s, when you had immigration after the Irish potato famine, you had white people, right? And
uh,
even older generations of Scotch Irish who were looking down their nose at the Shanty Irish that were coming in, and you had these nativist parties that were rising up because people were getting undercut with labor, and they were both white. So people will get upset at, new groups of people coming in regardless of race. Race really has nothing to do with it. It's just, hey, I'm getting paid $10. They're bringing in these new people who are working for $7, and that's why I'm angry. And so our political class has spun that, oh, you're a racist, and that's the
uh,
real it's a
yeah.
dog. No, you're bringing in scabs. You're replacing
For
the
real.
workers. Yeah. And but God, what were you going to say? I'm sorry.
Oh man. I just wanted to say about this MAGA communism, quote unquote. It's just something that sort of got started as a hashtag, more or less. Like there are a couple other internet commentators who saw that potential, like saw the fact that for whatever reason, MAGA conservatives seemed a bit more on the same page, I suppose. Like as opposed to rhinos, or I'm not actually that familiar with the way conservative discourse, like what terms they use, etc. Uh, but yeah, MAGA conservatives. At some point, I think it was Haas Aldine from Infrared. He
Mhm.
started using the term MAGA communism. It took off as a hashtag. And God, I just love stuff that like sort of short circuits people for a second. No matter who I tell MAGA communism to, the phrase just sort of shuts them down very, very briefly, whether they're from the left or the right. And it allows us to actually communicate for a second. But
It is odd. We're living through a political inversion where it used to
yeah.
be the Democrats who were the populists and for workers and stuff. And then that ended with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton essentially, he wanted to copy Ronald Reagan. So he bypassed the unions, he undercut the unions, and he went to Wall Street. And he was the first Democrat to get, Wall Street's coffers. And ever since then, the Democrats kind of flipped and they became globalists. They became Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
And the Republicans, who used to be the Goldman Sachs, all of a sudden you're seeing this populism, which is associated with the left. And a lot of the rhetoric that we're watching now is, the left. So it's odd that the progressives are actually the conservatives. They're trying to conserve a mercantilist international global system. And the
Ah,
MAGA people are now the William Jennings Bryant populist progressive. It's very bizarre. We're living through a strange moment in history.
absolutely, yes. Just as a last point on the political inversion, the current zeitgeist. Um, the philosopher Alexander Dugin, who I only recently like started to read and familiarize myself with, um, he mentioned this MAGA communism in reference to Jackson Hinkle, another member of the field, and he was simply describing how interesting it is that this is taking off as an anti-liberal. It's specifically the anti-liberalism of it that interested Dugin. So there's I suppose in the same post, he referred to Tucker Carlson as a paleo conservative. So we could say that we have some paleo conservatives and some Marxists who are all uniting as anti-liberals. And that seems like the definition of the zeitgeist, I guess.
Yeah, that is, yeah, very, very good way to end it. Let's wrap this up and
Hmm.
tell people how they can find your work.
Oh, come find me at Zaccaroni Pizza, or yeah, zaccaronipizza.substack.com. Um, I don't know. I'm going to write something up soon about libertarian communism. I'm going to have to rebrand it from MAGA communism. So libertarian communism. That's the American socialism for the 21st century, y'all.
Awesome.
And yeah, come find me. Subscribe, please.
Okay, well, thanks for coming on, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been a pleasure. Hope you have a great day.
Consider subscribing to my new podcast, Classic Paranormal. It's a clearinghouse for lost real-life accounts of true ghost stories. It's found on Apple Podcasts. Go there now if you're interested in enigmatic tales, chilling true accounts, chronicles from cases of the past that time has forgotten, but that the modern person who likes relaxing by a campfire swapping ghost stories might appreciate. As I said, the new podcast I'm launching is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and there's a link in the description below on this video.